Good evening and welcome from Besorah Institute. I'm Dr. Deborah Bird, and we are so glad that you're here for this special presentation. Tonight, we are honored to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Craig Keener. He is a New Testament scholar, author, speaker, and professor at Asbury Seminary. There he is the F.M. and Ada Thompson Professor of Biblical Studies. He is also the author of 37 books, with 1.4 million copies in circulation. His books have won 13 national and international awards, including 6 from Christianity Today. Dr. Keener has authored roughly 100 academic articles, 7 booklets, and around 200 popular level articles. You are probably aware of many of them. In total, Dr. Keener has written 19,000 pages over the years. In his presentation tonight, he will be talking about the reliability of the Gospels. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Craig Keener. Hello, Craig. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be with you. Should I be calling you Dr. Bird or just
Debbie,
what we've been doing
fine.
in email?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's fine. Okay, I'm going to go backstage and start your PowerPoint, and it's all yours.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd rather have everybody look at my PowerPoint than my bald head. I just shaved it, but it's the shaving is good because that way you can't see the part that really is always bald. So speaking about the historical reliability of the Gospels, as followers of Yeshua, we trust the witnesses that he commissioned, but how can we make the case for those who are not yet Yeshua's followers? My first time reading through the Gospels, after I went from atheism to being a follower of Jesus, which happened just when I met him through somebody sharing the good news with me, and then an encounter with the Holy Spirit within an hour or two after that. But my first time through the Gospels, I was like, okay, Matthew, that's really good. And then I read Mark, and I'm like, wait, he already got crucified and rose from the dead in Matthew. How often is this going to happen? I was bringing my own baggage about how I thought, the Word of God should be written. Like, I thought it should be dictated first person, be in chronological order, and so on. But that's not the way God chose to give it to us. In fact, historically, he gave it to us in a way that's a lot more readily verifiable. That is, 4 different accounts from 4 different perspectives, so that it's multiply attested. Well, we need to take into account the nature of the sources. It's great that there's 4 of them, but what can we say about the kinds of sources that we have? Most events in ancient history are attested in only one independent source. But even if we had just one independent source, we would need to take that seriously. So one book that I was writing a number of years ago, I was just making the case for where I thought the evidence was particularly compelling, the strongest possible evidence. And I wasn't looking at everything else. But I got into this habit of thinking this way. And so my wife, whose PhD is in history, and she's here in this picture, my wife would say something to me, and I would respond, can you give me evidence for that assertion? Now, there are different views on gender roles. So whichever your view is, though, I can assure you that you will get in trouble if you say something like that to your spouse. Anyway, she, as a good historian, made clear to me that the testimony of a reliable source is itself evidence. And so we need to keep that in mind. But we have not just one source that I would argue is dependable. We have 4 of them. So that's pretty good source material to work with. Well, what is the genre of the Gospels? Genre is the literary type of something, poetry, prophecy, science fiction, bomb threat. You write different things different kinds of ways. Hopefully you don't write bomb threats. But the genre of the Gospels, these are single volume works, each of them, about a single historical person. The overlap among the Gospels shows that they used sources. They weren't just making things up off the top of their heads. Well, what would an ancient reader call that? The strong majority of scholars today agree that the Gospels were ancient biographies. The primary feature in ancient biographies is the same as the primary feature of modern biographies. There are differences, but the major connection is they both recount the life, or at least part of the life, of a historic person. Now, the nature of the Gospels as ancient full-length biographies. Biography was a historical, information-based genre. The time in which the Gospels were written was the apex, the climax, the highest point of historiographic concern in ancient biographies. So you go a few centuries earlier, they weren't as concerned with the facts. A few centuries later, they weren't as concerned with the facts. But in the period of the early Roman Empire, you want to be technical, from the period of Cornelius Nepos at the end of the Republic to Diogenes Laertius in the early 3rd century. You don't have to remember that, but full-length biographies were expected to be repositories of historical information. Didn't mean they didn't write from a particular perspective or something, but it meant that they were supposed to keep their information correct. So if it were about some other figure apart from Jesus, and you were a modern historian looking at it, you would say, oh, okay, this is from the early Roman Empire. We know a lot about this figure. This does not mean that everything was meant to be understood as word for word. I think that's the next slide. Are we still connected? Yeah. No. Oh, boy. It looks like there's a slide missing. Anyway, it does not mean word for word. Nobody expected this in biographies until the invention of tape recorders. They didn't have, in the original Greek, they didn't have quotation marks. It's not even possible, translating from Aramaic or Hebrew to Greek, to make it precisely the same wording. I mean, you translate from one language to another. There's usually more than one way to get across the same idea. The Synoptic Gospels, though, they paraphrase less than most ancient biographies do. Another thing it doesn't mean chronological sequence. Ancient biographies were often arranged, they often arranged some information topically rather than chronologically. That's just the way they did it back then. But the substance of Jesus' ministry and teachings, this should be slide 9. The substance of Jesus' ministry and teachings, we meet Jesus historically in the Gospels. By the standards of ancient historiography, the Gospels are quite early and good records. So now going on to, they're definitely not novels. My first Gospels professor at a secular university during my PhD program, he said, oh, the Gospels are ancient biographies, but ancient biography was fictitious, and therefore the Gospels are fictitious. So I brought up the point that ancient novels were usually romances, a feature lacking in the Gospels. They usually lacked clear sources and historical prefaces. Occasionally there were novels about historical figures, but never about, to give comparisons with ancient biographies. To which the professor responded, I don't know anything about ancient biographies. So don't always listen to everything experts tell you, because they haven't always done their homework properly. Well, some object, and this would be the next slide, but the Gospels teach lessons, and they are readable stories. I mean, they're interesting to read. Yeah, but most novelists didn't seek to teach moral lessons through their works. Historians and biographers in that period actually did seek to do that. They would do it on the basis of information. Now, like novels, histories and biographies also sought to be entertaining or engaging, but by the way they arranged information, not by making things up. So far we've argued that they were supposed to be accurate with information. How accurate were they in terms of the details of the information? Well, that you can't determine just by biography, just by the genre of biography. That varied from one author to another. But ways we can test the authors to see how much flexibility they used. Were they writing about the recent past or the distant past? Normally, when they were writing about the recent past, they had first-hand sources or second-hand sources. When they were writing about the distant past, they admitted that sometimes they didn't have as much information available. The second issue is how closely do they stick to their sources? So we're going to look at that now. When writing about the distant past, sometimes they admitted that they had limitations, but many of them critically evaluated the sources they had available. The best surviving source on Alexander the Great, and this would be the next slide, is Arrian. He's usually considered the best source. He's writing some 450 years after Alexander the Great died in 323 BC. Now, think about how now okay, sorry, apparently it froze up. Um, we had a Metronet outage here in the area, and apparently it's still having some effect. So um, going on to the next slide. Biographies of recent characters. Uh, let's see. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay,
You're
sorry.
fine. You're good.
Okay, all right, we'll keep going. So biographies of recent characters, they stayed close to their sources. Their objective was not to invent. That was quite different from novels. And the next few slides, we're going to go through them really fast, just to illustrate that we actually did look at this. So maybe go to the end of this batch of the next slides, and that'll catch us up on time some. You can, yeah, just go ahead all the way through. Just the way you can compare the synoptic gospels. This is it. The way you can compare the gospels, the overlapping material in the gospels. Well, that's characteristic of ancient biography. So in Suetonius, he's an ancient biographer from roughly this period. He wrote a biography of Otho, who was a Roman emperor about 50 years after Otho died. So even later than Mark writing about Jesus, but basically writing within living memory. There were still people who could remember Otho. In his brief biography, I found about 70 points of correspondence to other ancient historical sources. And besides these, moving on to the next slide. Suetonius's biography of Otho is really short. It's less than 1/5 the length of Mark, Mark being our shortest gospel, about half the length of Matthew or Luke. If this biographic method is common, we would expect something like 350 such correspondences in Mark. And this is just where we can test this ancient biographer with other biographers and historians who wrote about the same figure. So, he doesn't know what's going to survive for 2,000 years. Presumably, if he's accurate where we can test him, he's going to be accurate elsewhere. So our expectation for ancient biography, especially about ancient biographies about somebody from within living memory of the biographer, we should expect this to be highly accurate, full of information that we would depend upon. At least if we didn't have a bias saying, no, we can't depend on this. It talks about Jesus, about Yeshua. So if you're open to the idea that, it's an ancient biography and it fits in all those ways, we should be open to the fact that it's telling us a lot of good information. So the point of this, and this would be the next slide, the evangelists likewise used information rather than just making stories up. So moving on to the next slide, the sources in the Gospels. How closely did the Gospels use their sources? And the next slide. The most common view, not everybody shares this, but this is the most common view. Matthew and Luke probably draw on Mark and on some other material they share in common, and other oral sources that maybe oral or written sources that just one use. Now, if Matthew and John were eyewitnesses, they also draw on the first level. I could go into all that in more detail. Mark, there's good. In the early 2nd century, Papias says that in the 1st century, he knew somebody who knew Jesus personally and knew that Mark got his material from Peter. So, we have a lot of, and that's within living memory of Mark's writing that he says that. So going on to the next slide. Now, the Gospels clearly and undeniably have differences. So we're not saying they don't have differences. The cursing of the fig tree, Matthew often abbreviates accounts, and so he can rearrange some things to condense them. That was well within what you have in ancient biography, which would be the next slide. Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian. When he writes about the same event in different works that he wrote, where he was present, he was an eyewitness, he differs from himself more than the Gospels differ from each other. Some adaptation, going on to the next slide, was just to make the language more precise. So Luke raises the level of Mark's grammar. Matthew changes Antipas from king, which was how he may have been viewed locally in Galilee, to tetrarch, which is how he was viewed by the Roman authorities. Matthew abbreviates Mark for space constraints, so the paralytic let down through the roof. Matthew tells part of the story but leaves out the roof scene. And, you've got kingdom of God in Mark and Luke. Matthew usually says kingdom of heaven. So, you have things like that. But going on to the reliability. Luke 1:1-4 tells us about what was available to Luke at the time that Luke wrote. He had written sources available. He had oral sources available, going back to eyewitnesses. Luke had thorough acquaintance with the events. And also we see in Luke 1:4, so this is a historical preface. Luke shows us that he couldn't fudge, because he says, I'm writing this to confirm what you already know. This was information that was already widely circulated by the time that Luke wrote. Now, the majority of scholars, this is the next slide, the majority of scholars think that Luke wrote between 60 and 90. You have some people who date it later. Some people would date it earlier. Well, actually, no, I don't think you have too many people who dated earlier, because the book of Acts, his second volume, ends around the year 62. But by the time Luke writes, he says many people have already written about Yeshua. And most scholars date Mark and the material that Luke shares with Matthew within 4 decades of the events. Now, are the events 4 decades before us, shrouded in amnesia? Do you know anybody who was around 4 decades ago? This is a picture of me back when I had hair 4 decades ago. When I was I was an undergraduate student at that point. So at least you know me. If you know anybody who was around 4 decades ago, they probably can tell you some things that happened 4 decades ago. And we don't normally say, well, you can't be right. Nobody remembers something for 4 decades. You know, if you were 2 or 3 years old 4 decades ago, that's one thing. But normally, you know, we remember some things for that time. So eyewitnesses could remember things during that period. So looking to oral sources, that's the next slide. Luke says, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. He's writing in a time when eyewitnesses were still alive. Handing down is the technical language of oral traditioning. The next slide. In oral historiography, living memory, that's the period when eyewitnesses are still alive, or someone who knew the eyewitnesses is still alive. Usually, living memory is defined as about 60 to 80 years. All the first century Gospels are within this period. That is, all of them. I mean, none of them are more than 80 years. The Gospel of John, usually dated in the 90s. Well, that's well within the period from the year 30 to the year to the mid 90s. That's well within 80 years. So going on to ancient Mediterranean memory. Memory was a big focus in the ancient Mediterranean world. You had storytellers who could recount stories hours long from memory. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. You had people who were completely illiterate, bards who would go around and just, from memory, retell those stories. Orators could often speak for an hour or 2 hours at length. Some of them did it extemporaneously, but many simply memorized their speeches in advance. It was the same for disciples of teachers. Their main responsibility was to be able to learn what their teacher taught them and to be able to promulgate that, to pass it on to others. So you had example of the Pythagoreans. They weren't allowed to get out of bed the next morning until they could repeat back everything their teacher told them the day before. And people would learn deeds as well as sayings. That was considered very important. And it was very important, obviously, for Jewish teachers as well. But I'm showing for those who, there's some scholars who say, no, the Jewish evidence is too late. Actually, we already have Jewish evidence for this in Josephus, but you know, we have it. It's just part of ancient education throughout the Mediterranean world. So it just fits all the evidence that we have. If you want to give examples of this kind of memory, you have Seneca, the elder. That would be the next slide. Seneca said, you know, I'm old now, but when I was young, my memory was good. It's not so good now, but when I was young, I could repeat back 2,000 names in exactly the sequence in which I just heard them. I could be given 200 lines of poetry and repeat them back in reverse order. He says, now I'm old, my memory isn't so good, but you know all those famous speakers you've heard of? Well, they actually, I went to school with them. We went to oratory school together, and you know, my memory isn't so good, but here's what they gave for their practice speeches decades ago in oratory school. And then he repeats back what they said. Now, you know, you have people like that today who just want to show off, get in the Guinness Book of World Records for memorizing a phone book or whatever. But there were a lot of people with really good memories because they trained their memories in special ways. So one person goes to an auction, at the end of the day, he can repeat back every item that was sold, the person to whom it was sold, and the price for which it was sold with no notes. Another person goes to a poetry reading, and after somebody reads a poem, he says, "That's my poem. I can prove it. I can repeat it from memory." And then after the guy up front who claims to have written the poem is so embarrassed, the guy in the back says, "No, I'm just joking. I just memorized it while you were reading it so I could show off my memory skills." It goes way beyond what is usual today, as I can testify as a professor who sometimes grades midterms. This was the most widespread feature of ancient education. Next slide, and then going on to the next slide. Greek philosophic schools. Sayings attributed to the founders of Greek schools were transmitted by members of each school from one generation to the next. This was encouraged by the founders themselves. And the next slide. Now, when we're looking at the disciples were not just people who just happened to hear Jesus, passing by. Disciples, by definition, were students, they were pupils. So they learned in a pedagogic context, an educational context, which was where memorization was most highly valued and most directly sought. Most of the church's most prominent leaders were eyewitnesses, and they were teachers' disciples. Now, everywhere else in the ancient world, that would mean that you should expect them to really learn what their teacher taught them. Why would we expect it to be any different from the disciples? So the disciples, then, we would expect them to be giving us actually what they heard and saw. And it wouldn't just be the sayings of the teacher. They'd memorize the teachings, which don't have to be word for word. It has to be the idea. But they also would memorize, and when I say memorize, I guess learn and tell about the deeds of the teacher. So there's a story in the Talmud where a rabbi was getting ready to make love to his wife and found a disciple under his bed. And he said, "What are you doing under my bed?" To which the disciple replied, "It is said that we must learn everything from the example of our teacher. I do not allow this for my students." But it's a way of the rabbis emphasizing just how much you had to pay attention to the example of the teacher. The behavior of a teacher could be used in the next generation as legal precedent for what could be considered acceptable behavior in light of the Torah, or unacceptable behavior, but usually acceptable behavior. It was often used as legal precedent. Communal memory. Sometimes people compare the disciples. They say it's like the telephone game. I whisper something in one person's ear, they whisper it in somebody else's ear, and after 30 people, basically it's 30 generations of passing this on, even if it only happens in a minute or two, because, it's all just passed from one to another. They say that's the way the Gospels were. Actually, that's not the way the Gospels were. And scholars of memory theory have explicitly said that's not the way the Gospels were. It's different where you whisper it to one person and they pass it on. Somebody's going to mess it up, right? Where you have group memory, you have a lot of people who can correct what the others said. And we know from ancient sources that actually they did correct what others said. Now, sometimes rabbis would pass on something to just one person or two people if it were like some secret message, certain ideas about creation or God's throne chariot, certain things that were considered mystical. But for the most part, they would teach groups of disciples who could help each other's memory. And memory theorists distinguish between net transmission and chain transmission. Chain transmission is like the telephone game, one person to another. But net transmission is you've got a bunch of people who all hear this together. That's not 30 generations. That's one generation. In terms of publication, teachers normally didn't publish their own teachings. Normally, they expected their disciples to do that. And they did, in fact, expect their disciples to do that. If the disciples were not literal, if the disciples couldn't write them down, that didn't matter because most people didn't write things back down. They just dictated them to scribes who would write things down. So Yeshua's movement very early in Yerushalayim and Jerusalem could have and probably did start writing some of these things down to circulate them. This had been going on for 5 centuries before the time of the Gospels. At least in Greek circles. In Jewish circles, there was more of an emphasis on oral memory, but it was not supposed to be less than written memory. It was supposed to be even more. So the next slide. What should we expect of Yeshua's disciples? Why would we expect his disciples to prove less reliable than other disciples of other teachers? Virtually all scholars agree that Yeshua was a teacher with disciples. Thus, they would likely have preserved the substance of his teaching. And some of the material shared by Matthew and Luke, we have good reason, I can't go into all the details. I won't go into all the details, but we have good reason to believe it was circulating while Cephas, Peter, and Yaakov, James, and Yochanan, John were in leadership in the Messianic community, the church in Jerusalem. So the next slide. Some conspicuously early traits remain in the Gospels. The Gospels in the form for biographies. I mean, Josephus and Philo could write biographies as Jewish authors, but they wrote them for audiences outside of Judea and Galilee. So the same with our Gospels. They're Jewish works, but they're written in Greek for something outside. And yet there are distinctly Judean and Galilean traditions and Aramaic figures of speech or Semitic figures of speech throughout this material. So going on to the next slide. Examples of this, we could give lots of examples. These are just a few examples. They're all over the place. But saying it'll be measured to someone as one measures it to somebody else, or take the beam from your eye before trying to remove the chip from somebody else's. There were other rabbis who said things like this. These were things that would be very intelligible in Judea and Galilee. The next slide. The phrase, "To what shall I or we compare something," is a way of introducing parables. That was a common expression for introducing parables. And then you'd give the parable, and then you'd usually give an interpretation of the parable. The first half of the Lord's Prayer, what we call the Lord's Prayer, is very close to the Kaddish. Our Father in Heaven was a common way also of opening synagogue prayers in the first century and in that era. The Pharisees' question to Jesus about divorce reflects a debate among Pharisaic schools from Jesus' day. Next slide. We know that from Mishnah Gittin, and it also fits the other evidence. Son of Man is a specifically Aramaic or Hebrew construction. The phrase, literally, the Son of the Man, doesn't make any more sense in Greek than it does in English. It's echoing the way that Yeshua spoke in his Semitic language. Moving mountains was a Jewish metaphor for accomplishing what was virtually impossible. Jewish teachers debated among themselves which commandment was the greatest, which is one thing that they asked Yeshua, and continuing to move on. Jewish teachers spoke of a large animal, and the biggest example of that in Judea and Galilee would have been a camel, passing through the eye of a needle as something being virtually impossible. There were debates in Yeshua's generation between the two Pharisaic schools in that generation, the school of Hillel and Shammai, debates about whether you clean the inside of the cup or the outside of the cup first. Yeshua uses that figuratively, but the point is he is he's speaking in terms that were intelligible, and he's speaking directly to Pharisees there. So it's, again, what we would expect. So the next slide. Eyewitnesses remained prominent in the early church. Galatians 2 and 1 Corinthians 15 show us that some of Yeshua's own disciples were in leadership in the church. They were the ones that people, even in the diaspora, even outside of Judea and Galilee, looked to them as kind of the founders. Well, Yeshua, Jesus, is the main founder, and then these were the disciples who were the living ones passing on his teaching. They were in leadership when Paul was writing these letters. Another issue is some people, they say, well, maybe they made this stuff up. Would they die for a claim that they knew to be false? I mean, people die for things that are false all the time. They go blow themselves up, but they don't ordinarily die for things that they know are false, not voluntarily. So Yeshua's followers really believed that they were passing on Yeshua's teaching and what Yeshua had done, and that they'd seen him alive from the dead. So far we've been talking actually pretty much about Luke 1 and 2, but now we're coming to verse 3. Luke also carefully investigated or had thorough knowledge. Now, the way that the wording that he uses, it's often translated investigated, but in ancient sources, especially historical prefaces, historians would often use this language to mean that they had actually participated in some of the events. And we know from Acts chapters 16 through 28 that the author of Luke actually did participate in some of the events. He doesn't make a big deal about himself being there, but he mentions himself as a we. And I know this is debated among scholars. I could go into a lot of detail. Actually, I think I have time maybe to say a little bit of this detail. Some people have said, no, that he's not really there. That's a fictitious literary device that was used by ancient authors. The problem is, it wasn't used by ancient authors. Nobody claims it for any other historical or biographic source. Obviously, in novels, if somebody's writing a novel, it's, a fictitious, everything's fictitious normally. So I or we could be a fictitious I or we witness, but not in historical works, which the strong majority of scholars agree, and this is scholars across the board, the more liberal as well as the more conservative, strong majority of scholars see Acts as a historical work. So if it's a historical work, it's not a fictitious literary device. You normally don't have that in historical works. Some claim that it's left over from a travel journal. Maybe so, but we again know from Luke chapter 1 that Luke had many sources available. He doesn't leave an extraneous I or we anywhere else. So if it's a travel journal, it's got to be his own travel journal. Why would Luke become an inept editor only at this point? Well, if you look at where the we occurs, it leaves off in Philippi. Years later, it picks up in Philippi, and then goes with Paul to Jerusalem. So it ends up, because of where we see the we's in Acts 24:27, Paul leaves Judea and he goes to Rome as a captive of Rome, imprisoned or under house arrest in Rome. But Luke is with him for 2 years, according to Acts 24:27. So moving on, Luke simply confirms what was already widely known in the early church. He says, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you've been taught. You normally don't make up things that contradict what your hearers already know. Same as Paul cites his audience's knowledge of his miracles, 2 Corinthians 12:12, and so on. You probably remember my lecture right before this one on paleobotany. You all were there, right? No, I can't persuade you of that because you know it's not true. In the same way, Luke is not going to make up to Theophilus and his audience, oh yeah, you were there, or you've already heard these stories. So next slide. Later debates central to the church are missing in the Gospels. If people are going to make stuff up, you'd think they'd throw in things that, were relevant to their own time. But they don't put in things like circumcision. That was a big debate in Jerusalem somewhere around the year 50, give or take 48 to 50, somewhere around there. But you don't have that in the Gospels. Please, next slide. Paul, writing 20 to 30 years after Yeshua's public ministry, attests some of what appears in the Gospels. Witnesses of the risen Lord, the Lord's Supper, Yeshua's end-time teachings, probably some of his ethics. So, next slide. Paul distinguishes between what Jesus said and his own application of it. So he's got to address the issue of divorce. He says, this is what Jesus says. This is what the Lord says. Not I, but the Lord. 1 Corinthians 7:10 and following. And then he qualifies it for a special situation. Well, here's a situation that Yeshua wasn't addressing. So I see this, not the Lord. He distinguishes. He doesn't make up sayings for Jesus. He reports accurately what Jesus says. And then if he has to address a different situation, he extrapolates and shows how to apply it. Next slide. If writers were freely inventing stories, we wouldn't have the kind of overlap we have among the Gospels. And next slide. The Gospels, just based on a purely historical approach, it's a good source for reconstructing Jesus' public ministry. And apart from Socrates, who actually had things written about him in a period when biographies were not meant to be as close to the facts as they were by the first century. But apart from Socrates, Jesus is one of the only figures of antiquity to have 4 surviving biographies of him written within living memory. Actually, with Socrates, there weren't even 4 people writing about that have survived. But we have 4 surviving biographies of Jesus written within living memory. So the next slide. The major Western basis for skepticism was originally just this. They said miracles are never reported by credible eyewitnesses. Next slide. Epistemic methods, that is how you know something, vary by discipline. Eyewitnesses are an important source of information in law, journalism, sociology, anthropology, and relevant to the Gospels, historiography. So we depend very heavily on eyewitnesses for historical information. Well, do eyewitnesses never report miracles? That's actually not true. So next slide. You can actually turn them faster than I say them. But anyway, there was a Pew Forum survey of Pentecostals and Protestant charismatics that covered just 10 countries. And the results of that survey, quantified into numbers, about 200 million claimed to have witnessed healing, to witness divine, what they consider to be divine healing. Now, if you don't like Pentecostals or charismatics, that's not nice. We should like everybody, but well, love everybody. But whether you like them or not, next slide. What's more surprising is that somewhere around 39% of other Christians who didn't claim to be Pentecostal or charismatic in these countries claimed to have witnessed divine healings. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people who claim to witnesses claim these things all the time. Maybe in circles where you don't hear about it as much. But anyway, next slide. The point is not what proportion of these claims involve genuinely divine activity or miracles. I believe some of them are. But the point is whether Hume, who was the one who said, we don't have any genuine eyewitnesses for this, whether he can legitimately start. Next slide. I'm not sure if I'm freezing again. Yeah. So millions of non-Christians have been convinced by this. So people not starting with a Christian bias or to make Christianity or Jesus or his movement look good. They changed centuries of ancestral beliefs because of extraordinary healings, not just, oh, my headache went away after a few hours. Some suggest that 70% of global Christian growth in the last few decades are due to people witnessing things like this. Next slide. China was not in the 10 countries surveyed above, but around the year 2000, there was an official source that suggested that roughly half of all conversions to faith in the Messiah were were the result of what they called faith healing experiences. One estimate from within the house church was roughly 90%, and these were people not starting with Christian premises. And the next slide. Dr. Balkrishna Sharma shared with me that 80% of those who come to faith in the Messiah in Nepal are due to signs. And the next slide. And this is also true in the past. Many of the church fathers claim to be eyewitnesses of healings and exorcisms that were converting many polytheists in the 4th century. And the next slide. Prominent feature of the Korean revival in the early 1900s. And next slide. Barbara Comiskey Snyder. I'm just going to give you a few examples with the time I have left. Doctors sent her home to die. She had an advanced case of multiple sclerosis. She couldn't breathe without a machine. She was blind. In her words, she was curled up like a pretzel. And there was a don't resuscitate order. Next slide. She heard a voice calling her to rise up and walk. She jumped out of bed, which was physically impossible for her. And then she noticed she could see her feet flat on the ground. And that healed. Normally, your muscles would be atrophied, but that wasn't even the case with her. Even though she hadn't walked for years, she was now able to run. I have to do stretching exercises before I can do it, before I run. But I consulted her doctors, and they all confirmed this for me. Next slide. And actually, all 3 of the doctors published on this. This was 1981. There was no recurrence of this. She lived on for 40 more years until she passed away from COVID just a couple years ago. Next slide. One of the various cases of blindness healed, we have a number of reports of this, was published in a peer-reviewed journal. After 12 years, there was a spontaneous healing when her husband prayed for her. And again, this was due to organic causes, medically attested. Next slide. Before Therese was Antoinette Malambe. I'd heard this story before, but it was when I was able to interview her, I was able to get more of the details. Antoinette Malambe's 2-year-old daughter cried out that she was bitten by a snake. She ran to her daughter, found her not breathing. They ran to a nearby village. A family friend prayed for Therese. She immediately started breathing again. The next day she was fine. I asked Antoinette Malambe how long was it that she wasn't breathing. She said 3 hours. Now, this, I have so many case studies, but this one really got my attention. Next slide, because first of all, 6 minutes with no oxygen. She got a master's degree afterwards. She finished the master's degree in Cameroon and went back to her country because Therese is my sister-in-law and Antoinette Malambe was my mother-in-law. The next slide. Yeah. Antoinette Malambe was my mother-in-law. Therese is my sister-in-law. So the next slide. Unless we're burying too many people prematurely, because I have so many accounts of this from eyewitnesses, including from doctors, that it just doesn't make sense that it's just we're burying too many people prematurely. Next slide. And then the next slide. Also, in terms of nature miracles, like Jesus stilling the storm, we have accounts similar that one of these is from one of my friends who was actually the best man in my wedding, a professor of Hebrew Bible, did his PhD at Hebrew Union College. And he grew up in northern Nigeria, where his father was starting new, winning people to the Lord and starting new groups of believers there that grew into churches in those locations. Well, they'd just come to one village where they were starting to do it, and it was rainy season, and people were warning, everything you have is going to be drenched because it's rainy season. Of rain on this village until I have a roof on this home. They laughed at him and walked away. He fell on his face before God, said, "Oh God, what did I just do?" But for the next 4 days, rain poured down all around the village. Not a single drop of rain fell in the village. And at the end of this 4 days, next slide, at the end of this 4 days, there was only one person in that village who had not become a follower of Jesus. Next slide. I think I'm almost out of time, but anyway, maybe I'll just wrap it up there and summarize that. Yeah, I was going to, and we prayed for it because of an outreach we were planning. It was supposed to rain all day. It was pouring down rain, and we prayed, said amen. The rain stopped. A few minutes later, the sun came out and was out for the rest of the day. But the point of all this is to say that people who say, well, the Gospels can't be reliable, and when they report miracles, we know eyewitnesses would never claim that, so that must be later legends that arose over time. Actually, that's not true. Eyewitnesses do claim such things, including myself. So again, back to where we started. The Gospels are reliable sources, full of reliable historical information about Jesus. And we can trust that as we read them, we are in touch with the actual Jesus, followers of Yeshua. The Ruach HaKodesh is also speaking to us through these texts, and we actually get to meet and know our Lord directly through them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Craig. We appreciate your presentation. We're sorry that there wasn't a good connection, but we gained so much from your presentation. Thank you very, very much. I would like to share with the audience Dr. Keener's information, if you'd like to learn some more about him and what he does, you can go to craigkeener.com, or you can go to his e-address, or the webpage at asburyseminary.edu/faculty/Craig Keener. We'd also like to say that if you'd like more information on Besorah Institute and what we do, go to besorahinstitute.org. There's lots of information there, or you can make donations. Also, if you'd like to send us an email, it's contact@besorahinstitute.org. Okay. And now, everyone, we just thank you for watching. May the Lord bless and keep you. Till we meet again, shalom and good night from Besorah Institute.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.